So without further ado, I will start talking about a summary of what the evidence shows us. And then Stephanie's going to talk about the Canadian guideline. And then we're going to go on to talk about some of the different educational tools that are available in Canada, including Making Headway from the Coaching Association of Canada, Massive Open Online Course in Concussion, the Concussion Awareness and Training Tool, the Pediatric and Adult Living Guidelines for concussion. So disclosures, I do work as a physiotherapist and I do treat people with concussions from grassroots to high performance professional. And I did co-lead the International Consensus on Concussion in Sport, and I have received research funding from a number of different organizations. So I'm really presenting this work that was a massive team effort of 114 people internationally that are leaders in the field of sport-related concussion across the globe. They're researchers, clinicians, and stakeholders. And this work is a culmination of the work from all of these individuals. So I just want to recognize the massive contribution. And I also want to acknowledge the 6 international sport federations whose logos you see here. They did provide an educational grant to support the administrative costs related to the preparation for the meeting. And they also coordinated the logistical processes for the meeting. But the scientific committee was separate from the organizing committee. And myself and Dr. John Patricius from South Africa co-chaired the scientific committee. The goal of this process was to follow a rigorous scientific process and develop clear messages and tools to equip the practitioner for diagnosis and management of concussion in sport, making sure these were freely available to facilitate knowledge translation across levels of play. And it's also important to recognize that these are meant to be adapted to local, regional, and national, geographic, and cultural needs. So these are the recommendations based on the research, and then we're going to hear how these have been adapted. There were a number of different outputs. For those of you that want to read more, they're in 2 editions of the British Journal of Sport Medicine, the majority of which you can access free. A priori, so in advance of the process, we developed a methodology to write 10 systematic reviews based on the most clinically relevant questions. And we also developed a consensus process and had this externally reviewed by experts in fields other than concussion to ensure that we are following the most rigorous process possible. We included anonymous voting, alternate viewpoints. All who were participating declared potential conflicts of interest, including people that came to the microphone during the conference. We had athlete voice included within the conference throughout, and we were really excited to also include parasport considerations as well as a medical ethicist. Like Dr. Mike McNamee was part of our scientific committee and had a great impact on the overall process. This is the consensus statement. I'm going to rapid fire some of the key messages for you, which you've already heard talked about a little bit today. And hopefully this reinforces and summarizes them for you. Definition of concussion, I won't go through it again, but I want to highlight that we also worked with the American Congress of Rehabilitation Medicine and the work that Dr. Noah Silberberg and Dr. Grant Iverson are leading to harmonize and identify diagnostic criteria for mild traumatic brain injury. This is an ongoing process. We did not adopt their definition for a few different reasons that you can read about in this editorial, but it is an ongoing process that we continue to work with them on. From a prevention standpoint, this systematic review was led by my colleagues, Dr. Carolyn Emery and Dr. Paul Eliason, who you heard from earlier today. There's evidence to support the use of mouth guards in child and adolescent hockey. There's evidence for policy to disallow body checking at most levels of adolescent ice hockey. And when you limit contact practice in American football, there's also a reduction in concussions. There's also evidence for neuromuscular training warm-ups. And this evidence is in rugby in males, both youth and adults. Now, there's also evidence across multiple different sports to show that neuromuscular training has significant decreases on severe musculoskeletal injury, and it also looks to prevent concussions. So this is an area of ongoing research, but it was recommended that neuromuscular training be included as a prevention strategy by the consensus panel. And implementation of concussion management strategies can help reduce recurrent concussion rates. We also developed new tools to be used in concussion. So we wrote 2 systematic reviews, one looking at recognizing and removing, and the other one looking at what to do from a reevaluation standpoint in the office. So we developed the Concussion Recognition Tool 6, the SCAT 6, and a new tool called the SCOTE 6, or the Sport Concussion Office Assessment Tool 6. This is the Concussion Recognition Tool 6. This is meant for all stakeholders, and this can be used to recognize and remove when a player has a suspected concussion, and it gives you instructions and a stepwise process of what to do. You heard me talk a couple of years ago about some work that we did with Parachute to develop a toolkit to help with that detection. And so that's also in the process of being updated with the new Concussion Recognition Tool 6. The Sport Concussion Assessment Tool 6 was also evolved, and this is a tool that's for healthcare professionals. I'm not going to go into detail here, but you can access this freely online with detailed instructions. From a rest and exercise standpoint, our previous systematic review, we recommended relative rest for 24 to 48 hours and then start the process of gradual return to sport and physical activity, as well as returning to learn. And there was some controversial evidence around the use of subsymptom threshold exercise, but thought that it may be a benefit. So we said that it should be considered. There's now evidence to support still that initial period of relative rest for 24 to 48 hours, including both light physical and cognitive activity. But in this first 48-hour period, it was important to limit screen time, because those individuals that did more screen time in that early period, it actually took them longer to recover. There's also a lot of evidence, high quality studies that show that aerobic exercise can help facilitate recovery, and you can start as early as 2 to 10 days. And this also prevents prolonged recovery, but should be individualized to the athlete. So we recommend symptom tolerated exercise. So you can have mild symptoms that increase 1 to 2 points on a 10-point scale, and brief symptoms need to resolve within an hour. If the symptoms last for more than an hour, or if they're greater than 2 out of 10, then the activity should be reduced or stopped and have follow-up. So that's a new thinking, and we're using the term symptom tolerated now instead of sub-symptom. And I'll talk about this a little bit more when I talk about changes to the return to sport, return to learn strategies. From a rehabilitation standpoint, we have more evidence to support our recommendations from Berlin, or the 5th International Conference. And there are treatments that can help facilitate recovery. And so in many cases, there are treatments that can help. And if an individual has symptoms for 2 to 4 weeks and is not showing improvement, that's the time at which referral should be considered, because there's evidence that these treatments can help around that 10 to 14-day time point. We also did a systematic review looking at persisting symptoms, and the term was changed from persistent to persisting, because many of these different problems that individuals have are treatable. And this is used for the 20 to 30% of individuals that may have symptoms still at the 4-week time point. So the research shows 20 to 30% of individuals still have symptoms at that 4-week time point, both children and adults, as you heard Dr. Ramsey say earlier. So a multimodal assessment is warranted to look and see what might be the underlying cause for some of these symptoms to identify appropriate treatments. From a technology standpoint, there are many new technologies that are emerging, but as of yet, they're not ready for mainstream use, but they are useful from a research standpoint. When we talk about assessing clinical recovery, the research is all over the place in terms of the outcomes. And so what we recommend is it's important to consider not only symptom reports at rest, but also with exertion, also including other outcomes relevant to the ongoing area of symptom provocation, and also looking at where they're at in the stage of return to sport and return to learn. We also spent quite a bit of time as an expert panel defining what clinical recovery looked like. And so these were the definitions that we included in the consensus statement to help harmonize those processes. So complete symptom resolution, the second point being resolution of symptoms associated with the current concussion at rest with no return of symptoms during or after maximal physical and cognitive exertion, just to highlight that one. And the good news is, in a meta-analysis in our systematic review on returning to learn, most athletes fully return to learn by 10 days, 93% of individuals, which is great. But in some cases, athletes are going to require a return to learn strategy and academic supports to help with return to learn. And these are some of the recommendations that we have for return to learn. When we pulled together the 5 different systematic reviews and looked at the outputs and looked at what the recommendations were, and when I was writing this section of the consensus statement, it became evident when we pulled all these pieces together, we needed to make more significant changes to the return to sport and school strategies. And so we actually got the expert panel back together and further evolved the return to sport strategy. So our new return to learn strategy looks very similar to the previous return to learn strategy. And except for step 1, the daily activities that do not result in more than mild exacerbation of symptoms related to the current concussion. So mild and brief, again, the same principle we talked about with the rest and exercise. From a return to sport strategy standpoint, the initial 3 steps we divided into the treatment phase, followed by clearance by a healthcare professional prior to moving on to the return to sport phase where there's risk involved. So the initial 3 phases, it's okay to have mild and brief symptoms. The body needs these symptoms in order to facilitate recovery, and it helps with what we call sensory motor training and follows some of the typical principles of rehabilitation. We divided step 2 up into 2A for light aerobic exercise up to 55% of maximum heart rate, and then 2B, moderate aerobic exercise, 70% of maximal heart rate. And then individualized sport-specific exercise provided there's no risk involved. Again, symptom exacerbation could be mild and brief, but they need to move back if there's an increase of symptoms more than 2 out of 10, or they remain for more than an hour. And then clearance, and that includes that they're asymptomatic of their concussion-related symptoms with the test of physical exertion, and there's no other clinical findings that suggest an inability to return prior to returning to any at-risk activities. And the last 4 steps are your return to non-contact and full contact training drills, followed by returning to sport. From a potential long-term effect standpoint, this is an area that requires more research, and there's a lot of challenges. They're really, really important questions, but they're very complex, and there's lots of limitations to the current literature, unfortunately. What the research did show was that there was no increased risk of depression, suicidality, in men of the general population, and individuals that participated in professional soccer for more than 5 years or professional American football may have an increased risk of neurodegenerative disease. However, there were, again, many limitations to the literature where factors that are known to lead to neurodegenerative disease were not considered in many of these studies. So this is an area where we proposed an interdisciplinary working group to help define the research agenda so that we can help get answers to these important questions using rigorous methodology. From a retirement standpoint, this is often a question that's tricky and really difficult, and this should be individualized, and a shared decision-making process should be undertaken with the parent and the athlete, and thinking about risk tolerance, the injury itself, the sport, and other ethical and socio-cultural considerations. This systematic review is a really interesting one. And if you're interested in this area, I suggest you have a read with that one. And we also included parasport, which was really, really exciting. There's a fantastic parasport position statement. And I think you heard Oz talk about that earlier today. And just really, really excited that the agenda is moving forward. looking at how we can improve care for all para-athletes. And I just want to highlight the great work of Dr. Jamie Kissick, who many of us know. He's really a pioneer in the area of sport-related concussion. And today we had a service spotlight in his honor, published in the British Journal of Sport Medicine. And unfortunately, we lost Jamie last year, but he really was a pioneer Canadian in this space. Pediatrics, really important to prioritize returning to learn, and also remember the benefits of a physically active lifestyle as children grow and develop. And we also polled our audience to look at priorities for future research. And I think you've heard this coming out of many of the themes today. Potential long-term effects, prevention, and rehabilitation were the top three. And I think we're hearing that theme as we move forward through the day. So I'll thank you very much for your time. And I also just want to say thanks so much to our entire team, and looking forward to hearing about all of the rest of the presenters in this session. And you can see the handout for all of the resources. Thanks so much.
What we wanted to speak to next is, what does that mean for sport organization, concussion policies, protocols, and education here in Canada? And the key questions I'll focus on in this short presentation are, how are international updates adapted for the Canadian context? What changes will sport organizations be asked to make in light of these updates and adaptations? And importantly, what resources and supports are available for sport organizations? Because we have great resources and information that will help you, and so that you don't have to start from scratch or feel like you're on your own to become your own concussion expert. So one of the things that's really important, and Kathryn highlighted this with the intent of the consensus statement, is to summarize the evidence, and that the information should be adapted to local context, to sport context, and the like. And so it's really important that we consider how we take on these recommendations and the evidence in our processes here in Canada. And I want to start by thanking and acknowledging the funding from the Public Health Agency of Canada, funding support to do this work for adaptation and harmonization in the concussion context, and also want to acknowledge Sport Canada and the Ministry of Sport and Physical Activity for the collaboration and support in working with the amateur sport community. Now, we set a precedent in 2017 in how we adapt the consensus statement to the Canadian context, considering our sport context, our healthcare system, but also the amazing expertise that we have across the country to contribute to consensus-based definitions from experts. And we see that same process happening with our clinical practice guidelines we have in Canada, which you'll hear more about later on. And so what we're looking to do is update that process with the new evidence, and keep that adaptation so that it's relevant to Canada, but also specifically relevant to the sports system. So Kathryn had to really quickly highlight the information in the consensus statement, but you could see there's a lot of R's, and there's a lot of evidence, growing evidence around concussion, and not all of that is the most high priority information for sport organizations to be aware of when building concussion policies and protocols. So what is that critically important information to get in the hands of those in and around sport? And so that's what we did with the Canadian Guideline on Concussion in Sport, and what we're continuing to do in the updated second edition. And as a status update, we have drafted updated recommendations, taken feedback, and we are in the process of incorporating that feedback and developing the final recommendations to ultimately share with all of you. What is consistent and familiar in the second edition of the Canadian Guideline is still looking at a comprehensive approach to concussion protocols, from preseason education right through to recognition and removal, assessment, and support for safe return to sport, school, and daily life. So you'll see that remain consistent if you've seen the 2017 first edition. So what's new? There are a couple brand new areas that were not included in the first edition of the guideline. The first is including some information on how the guideline should be used with consideration for athletes with disabilities. And this is a theme you've heard throughout the symposium today. It's a really important consideration that we include all people participating in sport and physical activity and individual considerations for this. Since the 2017 guideline, we heard about the position statement from the Concussion and Parasport group that's added considerable information for us to consider, as well as there's been some on-the-ground work in Canada through organizations like Canadian Blind Sports and Special Olympics Canada to better understand what particular unique considerations might be in place for their athletes and volunteers. The other piece we felt was really important to make sure we called out clearly and provided context on is prevention, and particularly primary prevention, so preventing concussions from happening in the first place. And prevention is very sport specific and context specific. And so it's really important that individual sports continue to work to understand their context. And I think we're going to hear a bit more about sport organizations and their use of research, which is really exciting to see those partnerships grow. But there is a strategic approach to injury prevention that we're providing recommendations on for sport organizations. So you can think about applying it to your own context, but what is the approach and the strategy, including things like ensuring you have data to understand the issue, that you're implementing evidence-informed prevention practices, and that you're evaluating and tracking to understand what's happening as a result of that implementation. Aside from those brand new areas, there, of course, will be updates based on new evidence. These are particularly focused in the area of concussion management. So those stages for return to school and sport and medical clearance, again, that Kathryn described, as well as making sure we're referring to the newest version of tools available. So, for example, the Concussion Recognition Tool 6. Other updates more generally throughout the guideline will just be to ensure that the language is really clear and some general feedback and use that we've heard over the years to make sure it's improved based on experiences of people's use of the guideline. And so what do these changes mean for you as a sport organization? Well, first, the first point will be to suggest to sport organizations to review and update all of your organizational documents related to concussion. So this will include updating your concussion protocol, again, particularly looking at that concussion management section to ensure we're following newest and latest evidence-informed best practice. You also should be reviewing your concussion policy. I mean, as good governance processes, this should be reviewed on a regular basis. But in particular here, you may need to review and update your concussion policy in light of the new information. Now, I've listed these separate because different sport organizations have taken different approaches with their policies and protocols. In some cases, organizations have a separate policy and then a protocol that's more of an operational document. So it's not embedded in the policy document itself. Other organizations have gone a different route where both the policy and protocol are combined in the same document. So depending on how this is laid out may impact how much you have to update in your policy. And finally, consider any of the forms, documentation, implementation tools you have associated with your protocol. For example, the templates for medical letters that we've previously provided, we included on those the return to school and sport stages to help ensure communication of that at the point of assessment and follow-up. If you're using that template, then you'll want to use the updated version. Likewise, if you have incident forms that have information about the stages of your protocol, a digital tracking solution, kind of like what Terry described earlier today around CAPT, anything like that, we want to make sure that there's that you do kind of a broad overview of all of the pieces that relate to your concussion protocol and policy to make sure you have consistent processes across your organization and communicating the same information. Likewise, flowing from that, we want to make sure that concussion information and resources more broadly are consistent and harmonized. So do you have information about concussion on your website? Does that need to be updated? Do you have any training or presentations, education sheets for different stakeholders? Again, considering and reviewing whether those need to be updated. And it's really important for organizational change and process change that everyone is looped in and that we communicate these changes broadly to anyone who will interact with your concussion protocol and information. Now, you're not on your own here, and we're really happy to have the support to be able to sustain the processes we originally built about 7 years ago now. And so what will Parachute and working with our partners be able to provide? Well, we will have an updated version of the harmonized protocol template and all of the tools that we developed before to go along with it. So those templates for medical letters, a sample preseason education sheet that you can use or use to cross-reference the education information that you're sharing through other formats. We also developed, and Kathryn played a large role in this, an adaptation tool previously to help sports consider how to make their return to sport strategy tailored to their sport. And we'll have this updated as well if this is something that your sport is looking to do. Now, in addition to having these updated pieces, we're not going to leave you on your own to go through and figure out what exactly is different. We're going to provide an explicit summary of what the changes are from the 2017 version so you can easily understand and locate the changes. We'll also be providing some webinar opportunities. We're starting with the national sport organizations and multi-sport service organizations, providing a webinar to go through the changes, resources, and also answer any questions. But then we'll also provide a broader opportunity open to all levels of sport, public health, any other sectors that are interested in the information. And through the funding that we have received, Parachute will provide one-on-one support to NSOs and MSOs as they review and update their protocols and policies. And we know each sport organization has different needs, capacities, and so we're really available to talk to sport organizations and figure out what you need and what we can help bring to the table to get those updates made as efficiently as possible, because we know that on your end, the hard work begins of communication, implementation, and all that goes with that. And of course, all resources and tools will be available in both official languages on parachute.ca at no cost, so there's no barriers to accessing this information wherever you are in Canada, and potentially to our international friends as well. Now, just to close off here, I want to leave you with a reflection question to go back to your organization or your role with an organization, perhaps, and ask you, what is your starting point right now? Where are you in this process? And just a suggestion on where you go from here. So do you already have a harmonized concussion protocol? Perhaps you worked with Parachute, with me, over the last few years to develop this. Perhaps you used Parachute's template or worked with others to ensure you had a harmonized concussion protocol. That would have been dated 2017 or later, because that was the last time that we had significant updates to our approach to concussion. If you have that, then the summary we provide will pinpoint exactly what's changed in that harmonization protocol. And you can simply make the recommendations as specified and take those through your approval processes. Maybe you have a protocol that was established before 2017, or you just realize that your protocol isn't necessarily harmonized. Then there's a couple ways forward. You can review the recommended changes and identify what updates are needed. Parachute can perhaps help you with this, or you can scrap what you have before and start with the new harmonized protocol template and get quickly on board with the updated recommendations. And either approach is a great one. And finally, maybe you don't have a concussion protocol yet, and we would love to get you on board. So in that case, straightforward, you can use the new harmonized protocol template, which we've heard from sport organizations is extremely simple to use. And again, we can help out with that and go from there. So lots of options for the way forward and simple support available to you. We don't want everyone to feel like they need to become a researcher in order to get caught up with the harmonization process. So thank you very much. I've left my contact information if you want to reach out with any questions about the processes. Thanks so much.